Thank you. Well, thank you all very, very much. I'm going to try to give you a very brief outline of some ideas and then toss it open for a few minutes for questions, and I appreciate being allowed to come over and spend some time with you. I think this is an extraordinary period, and I think, frankly, we haven't quite caught up with just how really extraordinary it is. So I'm giving you a little bit of a preview. I'm going to give a speech at Heritage, I think on December 13th, on the concept of the principles of Trumpism, and then, which is, of course, in this city, a very weird idea because most of our intellectuals here are too snotty to have actually read anything he wrote, because they'd already condemned him and knew that he was too stupid to be anybody, and they didn't understand why he was being allowed to run anyway, because he hadn't read their books. And you got some of that if you looked at both the right and the left criticism of the deal that was just made to keep 1,100 jobs in Indiana. You'll find that both sides represent. One of the things I want to recommend to all of you is to read a very brief essay, you can Google it, by Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan. And he wrote an essay about 600 words or 800 words called IYI, for intellectual yet idiot. And the essence of his argument is that at least 40% of the governing class in the world today are people who are really good at taking exams and writing essays. And because they're really good at taking exams and writing essays, they get into elegant universities like Princeton or Harvard or Yale, where they study under professors who are really good at taking exams and writing essays. And then they do well because they take exams and write essays really well. And so they graduate and they're then placed either in a government bureaucracy or a newsroom or working with a judge where they take exams and write essays. And that what you have now in Taleb's version is that about 40% of the governing elite, and by this way, this includes a number of people in your state bureaucracies, about 40% of the governing elite in the world today, not just US, worldwide, are people who could write a brilliant essay on how to change a tire. But if you actually had a flat tire, they would not have a clue what you actually did in the real world. And I'm telling you this because I think this is what nobody in this city understands yet. The heart of the reason that Trump emerged was he actually knows how to do things. That is, when Trump would go out and raise the money to build a building, the people actually expected a building. And so he had to contemplate, what does it take to build a building? And then he had to actually get the building built. And people came along and they checked to see whether or not it was a real building. So if you go, to his, any of the buildings that have Trump on it, you can go right down the street here. To the old, and by the way, the job they did on the old post office is unbelievable. You go look at pictures of the old post office 5 years ago, and you look at that hotel now, it's unbelievable. Well, but that doesn't count in Washington, except, of course, to make an argument about the ethics of whether or not the President of the United States can actually have a hotel that is named for him, and if a foreign diplomat stays in that hotel, is that, in fact, the emoluments clause, which is, by the way, a clause nobody in the elite media has looked at about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton for 8 years, but they have suddenly learned about this clause, and they are deeply, passionately concerned that if somebody actually stays at a hotel and rents a room and uses the room, that is an indirect bribe to a guy who's worth $10 billion. Now, let me go back to Taleb's idiotic yet intellectual yet idiot. Do you know how stupid you have to be to invent these rules? All of the rules that currently dominate this city started in 1978 in the wake of Watergate, when you had Jimmy Carter, who was fecklessly out of touch with reality, a man who personified intellectual yet idiot, and you had a left-wing Congress elected in reaction to Watergate, and they adopted a set of rules that are nuts. And nobody in this city is willing to get up and say it's nuts. And I'll give you the example. There are people in this city who, and by the way, one of the things you learn if you're in the 40% that's utterly, totally incompetent is you learn to pretend seriousness. You've all seen people like this. Do you realize what might happen? The kind of damage will be done to America if a French diplomat stays at the Trump hotel. My God, the indirect value to the president of having a hotel just down the street. So one of them was making an argument, a reporter, saying, do you really think that the 3 kids should be allowed in the White House? And I said, first of all, you mean like for Sunday lunch? Or should Dad leave to go down to his hotel and have lunch with him at the hotel, which Ivanka developed? Or I mean, second, you mean like in a meeting where, for example, the foreign minister from X would learn that Eric Trump was the son of Donald Trump? As opposed to not allowing him in the meeting because, when Eric goes to that country and drops by to check on how Trump Tower is doing in that particular country, or the Trump Hotel or the Trump golf course, and he walks in and he says, hi, I'm Eric Trump. We all know that that particular foreign minister would not have a clue that this was the son of the President of the United States. And therefore, we would have had a wall of separation between any possible advantage going to Eric Trump from his father being president, because luckily nobody would notice it. Do you know how stupid you have to be to think this stuff up? I mean, it's pretty funny for like a situation comedy or a late night TV show, but there are serious people at the New York Times and the Washington Post who sit around writing editorials based on nonsense. And then, of course, having written it, they believe it. And because they believe it, they have to act on it. And then they're offended because normal, rational people think that they're really stupid. And then they have to write an editorial attacking the person who thought they were stupid. So they write a really stupid editorial defending the earlier stupid editorial, and then they get out on a limb. And then you ask them, did you notice any of this while Hillary was Secretary of State? Not an appropriate question. We're not looking back. We're looking forward. So, having said all that, I'm going to give you 3 or 4 big principles and then toss it open to questions. Principle number 1. We are potentially, I was asked about the Trump rally on the stock market, and my reaction was, the great challenge to all of us is to turn the rally into reality. But we should not kid ourselves. I said to the president-elect the day after the election, you have now won a ticket to the dance. That's all. Now you got to dance. And you got to dance well enough to get reelected, and then you got to dance for 4 more years. And you got to dance well enough that your successor is a Republican. Now, if you get 8 years of good dancing, then you can write your memoir. But it ain't like the election. The election was the beginning, not the end. And the model I want to use is one that Lisa will remember fondly or not fondly, depending on your viewpoint, from the GOPAC days. And that is that we are potentially, if we do our jobs, at a genuine watershed. Now, I've always used the watershed model because when the rain comes down, if it hits this side of the watershed, it goes this way. If it hits this side, it goes this way, and it's decisive. So, for example, in the Appalachians, there's a point where the water will go either to the Gulf of Mexico or it'll go to the Atlantic. It's that decisive. And I'm going to try to really popularize, I'm going to talk about this at length at Heritage in a week. I'm going to try to popularize this notion across all of our systems. And this is part of why I told the president-elect I didn't want a cabinet office. We have over 4,100 state legislators, the most in the history of the Republican Party since its founding in 1854. The most ever. We have 34 governors, which ties the most in modern times. We have 25 states in which the legislature and the governor are Republican, which means, in theory, we should be held accountable for whether or not we're genuinely different. We have 52 senators after the Louisiana election's over. We have 239 House members. They collectively employ about 7,000 staff. And we have 4,000 political appointees in the executive branch. Now, all of us have to learn a new system, which doesn't exist today. I'm not here to tell you what Trumpism is. I'm here to tell you that we're at the beginning of an evolutionary process led by an entrepreneurial leader who has three characteristics that are amazing. He's three different people if you want to understand how Trump operates. He has the disruptive patterns of Andrew Jackson. He has the sheer biological energy of Theodore Roosevelt, and he has the compulsive salesmanship of P.T. Barnum. And these three weave together. These three weave together to produce outcomes that are dramatically better than anyone I've ever seen. A couple times during the campaign, he'd say to me, "What's my advice? What was my advice about debating?" And every time I said to him, "I don't have any advice about debating." He said, "You're a better debater than I am," because he's totally intuitive. He somehow senses the audience. He senses his opponent. He figures out exactly what language will work. His opponent stands there like a deer in the headlights going, "You're not allowed to say that." And then he just pounds on him. And after a while, you're thinking the same language because you've heard it so often, you think you thought it up. And it becomes definitional. And so you have a couple things. I'm just going to give you two examples. We're actually exploring, I'd be curious, we're exploring going back and reinventing the equivalent of the GoPack tapes and probably doing MP3 files. We're also thinking about actually literally putting online an evolving course that might be once or twice a month that you could download, you could whenever you wanted to. Because I think this is all so new and different, we don't appreciate how big it is. Two last examples. One, and I recommend strongly, if you have not read it, that you read The Art of the Deal and you read The Art of the Comeback, in that order. The first book is positive, happy, successful Trump in the 80s. Second book is life's gotten much tougher. He's on the edge of bankruptcy. Here's what he does to come back. But the two together give you brilliant insights. Here's my favorite, and one of the things that got me absolutely intrigued, and I give Raina Casey in Atlanta a lot of credit for this because she's the one who first got me thinking about it. The women's skating rink in Central Park broke in 1980. It broke in the sense that it didn't make ice. Now, this again goes back to intellectual yet idiot, okay? A skating rink that is not making ice is an embarrassment. You can't skate on it. You can't grow flowers. It's just this large space. For 6 years and $13 million, the city of New York tried to fix it. And they went to a firm in Florida. I'm not making this. This is a chapter in The Art of the Deal. I am not making this up. I talked to Rudy Giuliani about it at one point, and he said, "You cannot imagine how stupid this was." Okay, so the bureaucracy goes to a firm in Florida to explore ice making. And they come up with a really esoteric, green, sophisticated system whose only disadvantage is it doesn't work. They spend 6 years and $13 million. Trump, who has an apartment looking out over the park, finally gets totally irritated and begins to make fun of Mayor Koch and the administration. And Koch gets so angry, he finally says, "All right, we're going to give you $3 million to fix it in 6 months, smart aleck." Now, they've blown it for $6 million, for $13 million in 6 years, but they're going to give the entrepreneur $3 million in 6 months. All right? And here's the line that won my heart and made me decide that this will be one of the great adventures of American history, and that nobody in the elite media will get it. Trump says in the book, "Now that I was responsible, I realized I didn't know anything about ice making." Do you know how healthy it is to have a really successful person confess ignorance? And he then says the following. I love this. This is the heart of Trumpism in my mind. He then says, "So I ask myself, who knows about skating rinks?" And I thought, Canadians. I'm not making any of this up. So they kind of got on the phone and called the largest Canadian skating rink company, who flew down the next day, walked over, looked at the women's skating rink, and said to Trump, "This is so stupid. It's embarrassing." Now, I would like to find the equivalent of that firm to go to the State Department. And a parallel firm to go to the Veterans Administration. And you can go down the list, right? But that requires, by the way, the biggest fight of the first 6 months will be doing for the federal system what Scott Walker did in Madison and having the courage to do it. Now, here's my last example, and I hope you can take all this back home. We're going to work with Lisa to put together a whole range of insights that are specifically useful for state legislators. But here's my last example. And this relates to the U.S. Congress and to Obamacare and to health policy. The Congressional Budget Office was so wrong in how it scored Obamacare that it is an absolute violation of Trumpism to allow the Congressional Budget Office to exist. This is a bureaucratic institution of stunning incompetence, biased to socialism, that has no sense of entrepreneurial skills, could never have scored the women's skating rink. And by the way, when I called Rudy to talk about the women's skating rink, he said that wasn't the great story. He said, much bigger story is the Ferry Point golf course in the Bronx, which neither Giuliani nor Bloomberg could get built. So they gave it to Trump, and he did it in 18 months. Now, you can't possibly get the CBO to score anything at Trump's efficiency, Trump's speed, Trump's frugality, and Trump's common sense. Therefore, everything the CBO will score next year will be wrong. So why are we paying for a group of bureaucrats to sit in the Ford building and be stupid? Why not instead save the money? You know, if you want things scored, find 5 or 6 private firms and have them bid, and have 3 score everything, so you always have a competitive score. But why would you continue to pretend that the Congressional Budget Office makes any sense at all? And Trumpism is going to be about the following principle. If you see something that's really stupid, change it. Don't let people explain to you why being really stupid is smart, because to not be smart would mean that you'd actually be doing something stupid, and all of your friends would then think you were stupid because you were actually doing something that wasn't smart, when it's really smart to be stupid. I mean, that's the nature of government. Every state capital has the same problem. You walk around being told by your bureaucrats, well, you have to do it this way. And you say, why? Well, we've always done it this way. We were doing it this way before they invented pencils. And you say, well, have you heard about iPads? Oh, that doesn't count. You can't use iPads. I mean, if you used iPads, half our people wouldn't have anything to do. There's a hint there. So, can I toss it open to questions for a couple minutes? How do we do questions here? Do you guys have a roving mic, or just jump up and scream at each other, or what? Here we go.
Mr. Speaker, first, thanks for your service. We appreciate your message, and I give you a challenge. For the first year of the new administration, don't pass one bill that adds everything, pass 100 to take things out.
May not quite be able to meet that challenge, but I'll come back with a counter challenge. Every Republican state legislative body in the country should submit their wish list of things the federal government should quit doing, so the administration has a rich menu of taking things out. All right?
Mr. Speaker, thank you. You said something about Mr. Trump's tweets. I don't recall it exactly, but can we put you in charge of the tweets, or how can we gain control of the tweets?
Look, as I think you can tell, I have enormous fondness for President-elect Trump, and I think he is a truly historic figure. There are a few little things. You know, and part of the reason I've stayed out is I think somebody has to occasionally say the obvious. I mean, if the emperor comes running by naked, you should not say the clothing is really beautiful. You know, I am for him tweeting. I'm actually working on a proposal to rethink the entire White House press office, because it ought to be the American people's press office, not the elite media's press office. And I do a lot of Facebook Live. We actually just passed 900,000 on Facebook. And I do a lot of tweeting. We're about 1,600,000. So I believe in these kind of systems. But I think if you're the president, and I say this having become Speaker of the House, and I had to go through about a year-long learning curve. The things I could do as the minority whip were not necessarily appropriate to being the leader of the entire House and a national figure. And it took me a while to learn that. Well, President-elect Trump's going to go through the same cycle. The world is going to actually pay attention to what he says. So he cannot say things that haven't been thought through. It is incompatible with the scale of historic figure he's becoming. And I said at one point late in the campaign that there was a big Donald and a little Donald. And the big Donald is truly historic on the same scale as Reagan or as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the little Donald runs around and trips up the big Donald. And if the little Donald had been sent on vacation for the last 3 months, he'd have beaten Hillary by 6 points or 7 points. And as president, the risks are much higher, because every country in the world cues off the President of the United States. So I may irritate him a little bit by saying this over and over, but I'm going to keep saying it until he decides that he's going to have an editor. He can be fairly wild as long as he has somebody who checks it, makes sure it's accurate, because he's the president. He's not a candidate, and he's not some rich guy at Mar-a-Lago having fun. He is permanently, 365 days a year, the President of the United States, and that requires a respect for the office which the entire planet wants to respect. And so he's got to be disciplined in how he does this. I still want him to tweet. And actually, I like a lot of his tweets. And I don't mind if he picks a fight with the New York Times occasionally, like every day. But but I think it has to be thought through by somebody who's tough-minded and who's able to say to him, maybe not quite that one. Okay, one or two more. Yes, sir.
I'd also like to thank you for your service, Mr. Speaker. I know that's usually reserved for military veterans, but I'm sure you have enough scars to warrant that. But I think everyone in this room is well aware of government overreach in terms of the regulations, and we have many seminars that talk about how to undo those. I know that President-elect Trump has made it a campaign issue to discuss removing a lot of these needless and senseless regulations that do overreach. How do you see that playing out and rolling out in the next couple of months?
I think it's one of the places where the state legislators and the governors can have an enormous impact. Let me give you an example. The U.S. Forest Service, almost everywhere, does a worse job than the state Forest Service. You would have healthier forests. This is, I mean, you can hire any outside firm except the Sierra Club. You will have healthier forests, you'll have more production, you'll have greater economic advantage, and you can do it while maintaining species diversity. And state after state does it better at dramatically lower cost, which leads to the question, so why aren't we thinking through some model where the Forest Service may become a supervisory inspection service, but actually contracts out to the states running the forest as long as they meet standards of quality that are appropriate. I'm just giving this as a flavor. You're closer, by definition, you are closer even than members of the House to the people of your state, because you live at home, people can get to you easily, you see lots of things. You are perfectly positioned to produce report after report after report and to adopt resolution after resolution and to coordinate electronically across all 50 states so that as the Congress comes back starting on January 3rd, it's getting waves of proposals for things that ought to be either eliminated, improved, balanced. I mean, this is why I use the watershed. I mean, if somebody says to you, oh, we really can't do that, you have to ask yourself, you mean you're still living in the world of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson and Barack Obama? Because the first question is, why can't we do it? We have it, our Constitution allows a president and a Congress to have enormous latitude to modernize the government anytime they're in agreement. Our states are the closest to the people. So the states ought to be helping think through the replacement for Obamacare. Much of it ought to be returning power back to the states for you to think through how to do it. But then you've also got to take responsibilities. And I think I remember when Reagan came in at one point, I think it was in 1982, and he proposed an enormous redistribution of power back to the states, including the power to tax for a whole range of things. And all of a sudden, you had all of these Democratic mayors and legislatures say, whoa, 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 you mean we get freedom, but then we have to pay for it? And they suddenly said, well, maybe we'd rather just get the grant from the federal government. And literally, it was one of the times I began to realize you have to think about the whole process from school board. And by the way, you have a huge opportunity to take on the intellectual left in public universities. I mean, no public university should be as ideologically left-wing and thought control oriented as many of your public universities are. And you ought to take that head on. So one last question. If we have one last question here.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I really appreciate all you have to say here. I have a bit of you might call it a counter challenge on the tweeting issue. And rather than question whether the president-elect should be tweeting, I believe we need to question whether we're tweeting enough.
I think that's exactly right. There's an entire session, which I'll talk to Lisa about maybe putting together sometime in the next 30 or 40 days, on lessons to be learned. We're right in the middle right now putting out an electronic book that'll hopefully be out by the end of next week. That's just all the things I wrote and said over the course of the last 2 years about the campaign, trying to put in context how it happened and what happened. But I'm also trying to learn the lessons of what Trump did well and the lessons of other things. I wrote a report with Reince Priebus's help where we looked at 2012 and 2014 and put together, and then the 2015 elections, and put together what worked and what people had done right. And you're exactly correct. And I would like to work with Alec to put together a couple of packages that we would probably do, inviting folks to come in and spend a half day, then video the whole thing and make it available on the internet for everybody. Because I do think there are dozens, if we had 2 hours, I could give you dozens of things you could be doing, you should be doing. But for today's purposes, I just want to give you a flavor. Because your campaigns should be on this side of the watershed too, which means you go home and you represent every single person in your district. There's no longer that neighborhood you don't represent. There's no longer, if a Democrat is determined to be totally opposed to you, fine. But you make it their problem to be totally opposed to you, not yours. And you seek to listen and learn from everybody in your district, and you build an electronic neighborhood so everybody, all of you should be doing Facebook Live. I did one thing explaining the Gettysburg contract with the American voters. We had over 4 million views. Total cost, $0. So you need to think about we're entering a new world. We need to enter it together. We need to recognize that as Republicans at every level, school board, city council, county commission, sheriff, all the way up through state legislature, governor to Washington, all of us are on a movement to leave the old world that no longer works and get into a dramatic, dynamic world that's characterized by Trump and the rise of Trumpism as a model. So thank you all very, very much.